Welcome to the Engineering Seed podcast.
Thanks for joining me, Andrew. Just for context, what's your job title and how long have you been working at Cochlear for?
Sure. I'm the head of global talent acquisition within our people and culture group, and I've been at Cochlear for just over 2 years.
Yeah, okay. And so what types of engineers do you hire and what sort of areas in Cochlear can they work?
I'd say what rather than saying what we hire, what don't we hire, everything except civil, I would say, has a role here in Cochlear.
Yep.
Obviously, mechanical, electrical, but increasingly biomed related roles. We have lots of those as well. It's pretty broad. Everything from the basic research that we do, which can be very specific to a certain type of engineering, through to the initial phases of R&D where we have heavy presence of engineers, and then right through to the manufacturing site, which is had a little look through. Obviously the logistical elements of building that 147 station production line, and there's engineers right through those processes. So it's very rich and broad, the engineering disciplines that we draw from.
Yep. And so that's all in Australia at the moment then?
No, it's not. So while Cochlear is an Australian headquartered company and proudly developed the initial IP here, it is a global company. We have 31 branches around the world. We have manufacturing and engineering assets from largest to smallest. Gothenburg, Sweden. We actually bought a related company quite more than a decade ago called Bone Anchored Hearing Solutions. So effectively, if the cochlear is not a viable way to transmit sound to the brain, we would resonate the skull by putting a small titanium abutment into the skull and resonate it. It's called Bone Anchored Solutions.
Right.
I mean, you may have heard of jawbone.
Yep.
Here, that's exactly the same concept as what we develop, except ours is more refined because it's inside the head.
Okay.
So that's in Gothenburg, and that has a lot of engineers there. Next largest would be Belgium, and we have a large R&D site there in Mechelen. It does a lot of research into not just the biomechanical pieces of the puzzle, but also things like the embedded chips that we develop. And as I've discussed earlier, our chips are implanted in a person and are expected to work 16 hours a day for 110 years without failure.
Yep.
Those tiny little delicate devices can take a hit with a baseball bat and not crack.
Wow.
So they're pretty impressive, and a lot of that research is done in Mechelen. And then the third largest would be Denver, Colorado, where we've bought a company that specializes in more the software side, engineering software side of things. And lastly, not leastly, in our Brisbane office, we have a lot of engineers there as well.
Okay.
But yeah, probably here in Sydney, where our main production line is for what we call the C5112, which is the main signature implant we make. It happens here.
Right.
And 50% of all of our global assets from our people perspective are here.
Wow, okay. So I guess many applicants would come through, not only students, but many engineers in general. And I'm sure there are many individuals that are employable, but I guess for some they might not put their best foot forward. What are some of the, common mistakes maybe made by applicants? Some things they haven't done, or actually maybe they did do, which sort of reflected not as well on their application.
Yeah. So firstly, people need to understand that for most jobs, we want one person. And we may get a number of applications. So people often, when they apply for a role, they take quite a subjective viewpoint. I haven't heard back. Why wasn't I selected? They don't think, well, there were 1,200 applications for that role. Some from people that have 7 or 8 or 9 years experience in that role. So it's always good to think about the context of the type of organizations you're going for and the likely numbers of applicants they get. So for an engineering role at Cochlear, we will get a lot of applications of people who have strong experience. So often it can take, I've seen people have applied for 19 separate roles, and they've just kept at it. And eventually they found a role, which the manager perhaps has seen their application before and has decided to take a chance and invite them into process. So the first thing is understanding the numbers and the percentage chances can be against you, particularly when we're talking about entry-level roles. As far as the types of things that we look for in an initial application, in a perfect world, we'd like to see somebody with some really robust experience. And even as we were talking about in the elevator, in this day and age, grads get experience through their internships, through industry placements. Those are critical times during your university studies when you can start to build some credibility around your areas of interest and your actual skills. So definitely we look for all candidates. Have they done anything similar to what we do here? Now in Cochlear, we're making very small implantable hearing devices. So we look for people maybe with strong consumer electronics backgrounds, maybe who've worked in the life sciences, because being classified and regulated products, there's a lot of complexity around the process of making a medical device. It's the scrutiny from a quality control perspective, the regulatory framework that we work under the TGA, very different from, for example, a mining engineering context where those things are not even considerations of great magnitude. So having people with experience in similar environments gives us some confidence that the person will adapt and be able to succeed here.
Yep.
And again, HR people are risk averse. Why would we take a chance with somebody who has no experience, no track record in our work area when we have other people who clearly have worked in similar environments and succeeded? So that's often, it's very important that people get experiences related to the work areas that they're going to go into.
Yep.
That can be helpful.
Absolutely. Well, you certainly answered my next question. So I guess maybe from a general perspective, obviously it's, when the person is sort of meeting the values and of the company and they sort of align, that's, I guess, the one of the biggest parts of an application. But are there any more desirable skills that you see in engineers when they come through, or what something that the company sort of is
values.
Looking for?
Yeah,
value.
Absolutely there is. I mean, values is very hard to actually assess in an application, Declan. It's not something you can write a small piece about what your personal values are, but it's a piece of paper and your writing's on it. So I wouldn't actually include values as something we look for strong alignment. We certainly look for people who align to the mission, and we are a mission-led organisation. We're not digging coal out of the ground or selling cigarettes. We're doing a wonderful thing to help people, and we want to find people who resonate with that mission. So that's something that most mission-led organisations will look for. Does this person align with the mission? And the reason we look for that is that alignment with mission leads to a level of discretionary effort in our people. When an average Joe who's working for a bank who is not so excited about his workplace, he'll be done for the day. Our people stay back and do an extra hour on a project because they really love what they do and are so proud of what they do. So that is one thing we look for, is alignment to the mission, and that's something all applicants who are going into mission-led organisations definitely should. Here is why I think Cochlear is a wonderful place to work and why I want to be there. Definitely get that into a cover letter. The second thing I'd say is we hire people for their IQ, but they stay because of their EQ. 80% of a person's ability to work in a complex consultative work environment, of which any regulated industry is, everybody is working together all of the time, has nothing to do with their intelligence and has everything to do with their EQ. So we look for that, and that's hard in an application to evidence, but I'd encourage people to talk about how they've been able to succeed in collaborative environments, examples of where they've showed high powers of consultation. Those sorts of things we definitely look for because we know it's important. Now we'll test for that further into the process through psychometric testing, which gives us much deeper view around the competencies of communication and collaboration. But up front, if somebody had put into a cover note or had evidenced a strong ability to work in a collaborative, consensus-driven, consultative environment, fantastic. Very, very important.
Okay.
The other thing I'd say is people will often gravitate to the brand that, they'll think, well, it's a tier 1 brand and I want to work for that. And we get a lot of people that want to join for those reasons. So I always try and talk, particularly with mid-career candidates. If you've worked in a tiny little company, which is probably not very well recognised, and then you see, and you've been an individual contributor, and for whatever reason you're not going to be made manager, and you see a role for a manager in Cochlear, you know, good luck is what I'm going to say, because one step at a time, you know, come into Cochlear on the strength of your application as an individual contributor, or come into Cochlear because you have great management capability, but rarely can you do two steps with one in a career move, and people often don't think about it in those terms. So they come to us and they want to change career and they want to join a tier 1 corporate, right? Yeah. But again, we don't have to. We can take people that have worked in environments as complex as us, as global as us. So we're going to, you know, that's going to be our preference. We're going to take somebody from a Johnson & Johnson over some unnamed engineering firm in Lithgow. As much as I like Lithgow, it's a wonderful city. Yeah. You can understand what I'm saying. So make sure when you're applying for a role that it's some particular at a well-known brand, something that you can do in your sleep, something you have absolute ultimate capability and strength in at this moment, and the career growth you should expect to come later. And all good companies, Cochlear included, grow our people. We keep our people because we keep them engaged and give them opportunity, but don't try and do those two jumps in one go, if that makes sense. Yeah. If I go back to your question around on the application, the average recruiter, and there's been studies on this, reviews an application. Yep. How long do you think they look at it for?
Probably 3 seconds.
It's a bit better than that. It's 9 seconds.
Okay.
And what are the 3 things that they look for? They actually did eye tracking, a study of eye tracking of recruiters as they go through applications. What are the 3 things that most recruiters will look at?
Clear name.
Name? They look at the name. What else do they look for?
The experience that they've had.
No, they're going to look at the name of the last company.
Okay.
And they're going to look at the name, interestingly, of where they live.
Okay.
That's what recruiters do. And it's not because of any bias, it's just human nature.
Yep.
Why do you think they're looking at name?
I guess a name does give a lot of context about who they are, where their traditions are from, and then I guess maybe what that means in their values and things like that. It's
an unconscious thing.
Yep.
It's an unsavory habit that we all have. Humans are affiliative. We like people like ourselves. So if I see a name like Declan, I'm going to think, well, probably Anglo, probably from a first world background, and I'm going to make certain assumptions about you as a candidate. If I see a name like Kotaru or Swami, I'm going to make different assumptions around that name. Now, I've lived and worked 20 years overseas, so I've forced myself not to make any assumptions, but it's a very unfortunate point that people can't help but be affiliative in the way that they assess CVs. So I'm not suggesting that people change their names, but what I do suggest, if I saw a name, my initial concern would does this person have work rights in Australia? Because that's a big issue for many companies. Either they can't sponsor or they don't want to sponsor. It's a relatively risky undertaking to sponsor candidates. The cost is not insignificant. And if somebody's coming from a culture different to your own, successful onboarding in that organisation is less. There's no doubt about it. You've got not just the corporate culture you're dealing with, but the fact that you're potentially new to the country. So, if any of your readers don't have classical Anglo names, I'd encourage them to put underneath their name, Australian citizen, residency in Australia, straight under that, because that is the primary concern that recruiters in all entities and organisations will be thinking.
Yeah. Okay. And so, if they've moved to Australia, would you suggest even how long they've been in Australia, or
right up there underneath the name, give them that 9 second rule. They're not going to ferret around through that CV and find that, one paragraph from the bottom, deal with it right there on the spot.
Yep.
Work rights, 10 years in experience, have that literally there.
Up the top.
The second thing is location.
Yep.
Where'd you come from today?
Oh, just in CBD.
Okay, it wasn't too painful, but
no.
But if we see Cronulla or something like that,
yes,
or God forbid even further afield, the initial assumption we'll be making is, well, that's going to be hard for this person. That's going to be 2 hours a day in transport. So
absolutely,
think about your location and how people may perceive that location. So if you were in a situation where you're in low Blue Mountains and you're applying for a role in a company in the CBD, I'd put in brackets, have successfully worked in a role in the CBD over the last 10 years.
Yep.
Something like immediately address that concern.
Okay.
Those are two examples.
Yep.
Company name, it is very much about, okay, they've worked at GE. Yeah, they're going to know what a big, large, complex organisation is like. Or they've worked at, I don't know, a Baxter, so they know healthcare and they'll understand that industry. So if you don't have that, you need to address that as well. Because people will always, if I can take somebody who's worked in a large global corporate in a life sciences environment over somebody who's never had any of those experiences and potentially may not like the environment, not succeed in the environment. From an engineering perspective, it's a very regulated industry. It's a different world. The level of documentation is inordinate. You know, you take one step forward and then you spend the next day writing out documentation around this because we have to have incredibly detailed records of the decisions made and what we do. Because this product is an electrical device going into people's heads through brain surgery, right? Something went wrong, they want to know what went wrong and why. So those sorts of concerns will come out with an applicant is, they've worked in the rail industry. They're not going to have any of that sensitivity or understanding to the complexity of my world. So trying to address and myth bust those things somehow is probably the biggest piece of advice, given that 9-second rule. And perseverance, that very first point I made, you know.
Applying 20 times.
And different channels, you know. Do you know anybody at that company? Can you get a referral? Employee referrals, we have what we call a quality of hire hierarchy, and the best sources of hire are employee referrals, graduates, and internal candidates. Direct applicants at the very bottom of that pool, number 10. Is so, you know, we will do many things before we actually look at direct applicants to roles. So often it's being represented by an agency is not a bad thing. Recruitment agents are higher up on that food chain because they take the time to know their candidates. They can, in a very short soundbite, come to me in my very busy life and say, Andrew, I know you're going to be worried at location. He's based in, North Ryde. He's an Australian citizen and he's working in life sciences. And they go, okay, this is a candidate I'm interested in. They can do a lot of that for you. So I also suggest that going through an agency is not a bad thing for certain roles. But when you do apply, do you know anybody there? Put an interesting and unusual cover note in. I had one recent applicant who took a picture of herself and sent that in attached to her CV, and it just had a few simple words on that picture. It was very heartwarming and it was clearly resonated, and it made me forward that on to the hiring manager for review. So this is an unusual approach. So try and take an unusual
and personal.
Yes, it is tough. I mean, thankfully it's a candidate-driven market in Australia. You know, there are not enough good people for the jobs that we have, but that wasn't the case. You know, even a few years ago, where a lot of grads were not getting positions. It's a little better now in Australia, but I have a lot of sympathy for other countries where grads in Spain or Portugal, 30% of them aren't going to get a job for the first 3 or 4 years.
Wow.
Much tougher place to be.
Wow.
There
you go.
Okay. Well,
thank you so much.
Cheers, pleasure.